Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give folks a couple of minutes to get connected, and then we'll get started shortly. All right, so it looks like we've got lots of people joining us this evening, so welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here as a few more people continue to trickle in this evening. All right, looks like we've got most people in the meeting now, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name is Janine Higgins, and I'll be the facilitator for our session tonight. I also have my colleagues Jenna and Heather supporting on some of the technical aspects of tonight, so they'll be here working away in the background, but you likely won't see them on camera for this evening. So while we normally host these sessions in person, we're so glad to have technology to support us and allow us to still gather online during these unprecedented times. And just to let you know, today's meeting is going to be recorded, and the recording will be posted on our engagement webpage as well as actually on our YouTube account tomorrow. So if you can't stay for the whole thing tonight, then no worries, you'll be able to watch it tomorrow. So to start off, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am joining this evening from Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory, and I acknowledge the many First Nations and Métis whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. I honor and respect the elders of the past, the present, and the future. And I ask that since we are gathering tonight from across Alberta, that each one of us personally acknowledges the Indigenous people of your region. So for this evening, we are going to go through a bit of a welcome with some housekeeping items in terms of how our session will go for tonight before we move into a presentation from our lead speaker. So we'll have that presentation talking all about our fisheries, proposed fisheries and management regulation changes for the south region of Alberta before we move into our question and answer for this evening. We'll have about an hour for the question and answer before the meeting closes at 8:30 p.m. tonight. So for the Q&A, if you didn't join us last week, we'll just walk you through the process for this. I know we had lots of folks join us for sessions last week, and we see lots of people joining us tonight, which is fantastic. So first off, thank you to everybody who submitted questions through your Zoom registration. We are going to be starting off our Q&A session by responding to 3 of the common questions that we heard through there. And then we'll be moving into the live Q&A. So for the Q&A, I see some people have already found it, which is fantastic. So you can go ahead and click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and that will open up a window for you. So that's the window where you can go ahead and type your questions. Now for this evening, we already have over 260 people joining us online right now, which means that unfortunately we will not be able to answer everybody's questions tonight. So what that means is that we will be using our upvoting tool in order to help us sort questions. So if you see a question that you would like to see or hear the answer to, you can go ahead and click that upvoting button. And then, like I said, that's one of the ways that we'll be sorting through our questions for this evening. So in terms of the types of questions that are going in there, of course, we're here discussing the South region tonight. However, any questions that are submitted that are inappropriate in nature or if they have profanity in them, they will be deleted. And if we get questions that we've already spoken to, so we have been finding sometimes that we're getting sort of a bunch or a series of questions that are all on the same topic, we're going to respond to those and then we'll try to dismiss them to move on to other questions. So tonight we really do want to answer a broad variety of questions on as many topics as we can. So if we find that we're getting a bunch of questions on the same topic, we will try to address them in a group and then dismiss them after that. So if we don't get to your question tonight, no worries. There's still lots of opportunities to get involved and engaged with us throughout this sport fishing regulation engagement. So if you haven't been onto our engagement webpage already, there is an Ask the Expert section there. So you can submit questions and you can also view other questions that people have asked. So again, if we don't get to your question, that's a great opportunity to go and look. You can also sort through the tags on those questions and be able to see if you're only interested in walleye or different water bodies, you can look through and see the responses that have been provided. And if your question isn't there, then you can go ahead and type it in and we'll get back to you. So in terms of who's with us tonight, our lead presenter is Jason Cooper. He's our senior fisheries biologist, and he'll be taking us through the presentation. And then he will be joined by the rest of our panel. So on the panel tonight for our senior fisheries biologists, we have Jessica, Shane, Paul, Dr. Stephen, and Dr. Andreas. We also have Caitlin, who's a fisheries biologist, Stuart, who is our fisheries manager, Craig, who is going to be supporting us more on the technical aspects of things. So you may not see him too active on the panel tonight. And then we also have Dave, who is our Director of Fish and Wildlife Policy, and Craig, who is our Fish Culture Manager. So we've got a whole group of people here who will be able to help support us once we move into the Q&A. But with that, I would like to pass it over to Jason Cooper, who's going to take us through our presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Janine. Just hoping you can hear me on loud and clear on your side.
You bet, we can hear you well.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for taking time this evening to attend this webinar. I'll be speaking and providing a high overview about fisheries management in the South region, transition into those various types of fisheries, those being lakes and reservoirs, our stock trout waters, and of course our rivers here in the South. I'll briefly touch on the various management actions and quickly highlight the work staff have conducted on some of these incredible fisheries. Then finish with reviewing the proposed regulation changes here in the South for 2021. But more importantly, as Janine mentioned, we're here to listen and answer your questions. I believe it's hard to dispute the statement that the South region provides some of the most diverse array of landscapes and also truly unique fishing opportunities here in our great province of Alberta, from high mountain lakes and streams to slow moving rivers and many fantastic lakes and reservoirs. The South also has the most diverse array of fish species in the province, from various trout to walleye and pike, all the way to trying to catch Alberta's largest sport fish, that being lake sturgeon in one of our large rivers. The South region also has the majority of Alberta's human population within this region. Hence, lots of opportunity, lots of great spots, but lots of fishing effort. In terms of fish management zones, that's how the Alberta Fishing Regulation booklet is structured, so you're probably familiar with that. The South region occupies 4 distinct zones, those being PP1 and 2, ES1 and 2, and also extends into the south portion of NB1. There are 6 fisheries offices with staff located in Spruce Grove, Red Deer, Rocky Mountain House, Cochrane, Blairmore, and our Lethbridge location. There are well over 100 water bodies that are actively managed in the South region as seen on the map, but noting there are a number in that southern portion of NB1 as well that are just not shown on the map just because of that overlap. Of course, we may not have the most number of lakes in the province when compared to our 2 north regions, but I know everybody has one or two favorite ones that they like to fish at here in the South. Last year, we heard from you and gathered a lot of feedback on the lakes and reservoirs, which resulted in a number of regulation changes and new fishing opportunities, both provincially and especially here in the South. We actually had 9 water bodies that changed to a more enhanced or liberal opportunity of one fish any size for both pike and walleye. There were new harvest lot regulations put in place for pike and walleye on 11 water bodies here in the south. But unfortunately, the walleye stocking program was postponed last April and May as most of our country was in a complete lockdown at that time. So that we weren't able to do that last year. And also some of our planned fish transfers, with the exception of golden trout, were canceled as well due to COVID-19. But we're optimistic both walleye stocking and fish transfers will proceed for 2021. In efforts to support assessing and evaluating lakes with those new harvest slots, staff were out this summer on 6 water bodies counting and conducting angler interviews. If you were out fishing either at Gardner or Floating Stone up by St. Paul, or either closer to Edmonton and Red Deer being at Lac St. Anne, Buck Lake, Pigeon Lake, or Gull Lake, there was a really good chance you saw us drive by. Or if you were just simply too busy reeling in that big fish, we seen you and you were counted. We actually estimated 121,000 fishing trips on just these 6 water bodies this past season. Hopefully last week you're able to tune into that provincial webinar on harvest slots. If not, no worries. You can go back to that engagement page and see that recorded webinar. And I would encourage you to do so if you want to learn more about those changes and that work. As part of our active monitoring program and fish stock assessments, staff were really busy last September and completed index netting survey at 14 water bodies here in the south. Because of time, for more details, those reports are all posted online at the website shown at the bottom of the slide. And there's also a direct link on our engagement page as well. So in terms of stock trout waters in the south region, as you can see from this map, there's a wide dispersal throughout the entire region, from small urban ponds, likely located in your town or city, to ponds out in the windswept prairies, to high alpine lakes. In 2020, there were 102 water bodies stocked in the south region. Those stockings cumulatively totaled over 1.1 million trout. That's a lot of trout, amazing. Another interesting fact is 3 of the 4 provincial fish culture facilities are located in the south region. They're the 2 brood trout facilities, Allison Creek located in the Crow's Nest Pass, the Raven brood trout facility located near Caroline, and the 3rd facility being Sam Livingston Fish Hatchery located on the banks of the Bow River right in Calgary. In last year's fisheries engagement sessions, increasing and diversifying trout stocking was a major theme as well. As a result, we added 4 additional tagger trout water bodies, those being West River Edge, Hassey, Heritage, and Dixon Trout Pond, for now a total of 19 tagger trout locations here in the south. As mentioned previously, we reinvigorated the golden trout program with fish transfers occurring at Upper and Lower South Fork and Barnaby Lake, with those golden trout being sourced from Rainy Ridge Lake. We added a new stock trout fishery, that being Hassey Lake, just west of Stony Plain, in partnership with the Alberta Conservation Association, and we're actually working on adding more for 2021. Unfortunately, due to COVID, similar with the walleye program, the recreational cutthroat stocking program was postponed, but is planned to carry forward for this coming year as well. When it comes to stocked trout waters, there are many more management actions than just simply stocking trout into each of these locations every year. We also conduct fish kill investigations. There's disease testing on some of our ponds if need be, winter dissolved oxygen evaluations, angler use surveys, netting assessments as a means to evaluate management and stocking objectives, to even conducting invasive fish species removal. Certainly, we don't do this alone. We partner with various groups and organizations such as our provincial fish culture and hatchery experts, our AAP science and monitoring group, like some of our limnologists, the Alberta Conservation Association, especially when it comes to those locations with aeration, and municipalities such as the special areas, amongst some others. As for rivers here in the South region, there's both the North and South Saskatchewan river basins and also a portion of the unique Milk River Basin in the far south. Some of the southern Alberta river fisheries are highly prized for their wild trout populations and are world-renowned, like the Bow River, the North Raven, the Ram, the Old Man, the Crow's Nest, all come to mind really quickly. Rivers like the North and South Saskatchewan also have a really wide diversity of species and host fish that can be, as large as some of the anglers themselves, being the lake sturgeon. Southern Alberta is also host to two Alberta's well-known native trout, those being West Slope cutthroat and bull trout, which are currently provincially and federally classified at risk. Alberta intends to recover these populations where possible using the best available science to inform where we should focus those recovery actions. Again, due to time tonight, additional information on the native trout and those two species at risk can be found on our native trout provincial webinar that was hosted last week. And yeah, I would encourage you to tune into that webinar to learn more. Southern Alberta is also host to other fish species at risk. While lake sturgeon are known quite well by many anglers, there are other species that only exist in single drainages in Alberta here, in the South region. The stonecat, the western silvery minnow, and Rocky Mountain sculpin only occur in the Milk River and Upper St. Mary River, respectively. Anglers may not think of these fish as important, but nonetheless, they remain an important part of Alberta's biodiversity. Many anglers, as you know, participated in last year's engagement sessions and shared valuable feedback and perspective on some of the ideas we proposed associated with rivers. We actually found that there was very little public support for increased non-native trout harvest in some of the southern rivers that were proposed last year. We heard from you, and as a result, did not proceed with those proposals presented last January in those sessions for additional trout harvest opportunities on flowing waters. Next, here are a few examples of some of the river assessments and river work that staff are working on here in the south. Many of you may have learned that there was a detailed population analysis conducted by the University of Calgary that showed a population level decline in rainbow trout from 2003 to 2013 in the Bow River. As a result, staff are now working on a cumulative effects assessment for the Bow River, where this assessment will help to understand which factors are threats and will help us develop management actions to these. Also in 2020, we completed a Bow River population assessment to understand the health of the fish population. While noting whirling disease is present in the Bow River, we're actually not currently seeing any indications that it's affecting the populations at this time. We also assessed the Crow's Nest River fish community for the first time since 2010. Additionally, AEP has produced a whirling disease report that's available online showing effects on the Crow's Nest River itself. Staff also assessed the Milk River last season, as there's a rare opportunity to sample 4 federally or provincially listed species, and those noted before being the plain sucker, the Rocky Mountain sculpin, western silvery minnow, and stonecat. Here are just a few more additional management actions on our rivers that staff have been working on in the south as well. Work that's ongoing with the bull trout recovery programs on the Tay River and at Pinto Lake. There's habitat reclamation projects on Rocky and Fall and McHugh Creeks, the West Slope cutthroat recovery stocking initiative as well. And then we've also got the lake sturgeon recovery. Again, simply due to time, most of these projects are covered in much more detail in that native trout provincial webinar, and I would encourage you to tune into that recorded webinar to learn more on these. Now for our last portion of the presentation, I'll review quickly the proposed consultation and notification changes here in the south for 2021. important to note with these consultation changes, I want to remind you about the importance of providing your feedback on these water bodies, especially if you fish them. Please take the online engagement survey and have your say. The survey is on the main engagement webpage, and that website and link will be provided and noted at the end of the webinar here. Or if you've got questions on any of these water bodies, please type them into the question box as well, and hopefully we can get to those questions this evening. So as such, the first consultation water bodies with respect to lakes here in the South region for 2021 are Cow Lake, Burnt Stick Lake, Wabaman Lake, and then there's upper and middle chain lakes as well. And they're highlighted here accordingly on the map. So for the first one here, upper and middle chain lakes, is just a simple notification where fisheries is notifying of a regulation change on both upper and middle chain lakes that will now align the sport fishing regulations with Maggie Lake, which is the lower of those three chain lakes, in terms of both the season and also that pike regulation moving from the default 3/63 to 1 pike no size. This change results in providing additional harvest opportunities for northern pike. It will simplify the regulations, as now all three water bodies will be the same. And that also assists not only you, the anglers, in terms of simplifying it, but also makes the enforcement easier for our enforcement officers there as well. The next water body is Cow Lake. It suffered a severe winter kill of the stock pike population there last winter in 2020, and now opens the door for potentially changing the fish management approach at this particular lake. We want your input on to whether or not to continue managing the lake as a pike and perch fishery, or perhaps trying switching back to that stocked trout fishery that it was known for earlier. With that in mind, there are a number of considerations and trade-offs for you to consider with that choice. So obviously, because of that winter kill, it will take several years for the pike to recover. So catch rates for pike in the next couple of years will be lower than what anglers have experienced in the past. Currently, it's not a feasible option to either aerate or completely eradicate the pike or perch from Cow Lake. This simply due to the lake size. If trout are to be stocked, they would be impacted by winter kill far more frequently than pike. They're certainly more sensitive to lower dissolved oxygen levels. That means the annual stocking of trout would be required, and that angling experience for trout may be inconsistent. Large trout will only occur if there's a couple of good years that they survive in a row. There's also a risk that with pike and perch being present, they could negatively impact the trout that would be stocked. Obviously, pike eat trout, so hence there could be fewer trout for anglers to catch. And there's also that competition between perch and trout that could result in maybe some skinnier or poor condition trout as well. Our next water body is Burnt Stick Lake. It was assessed just this fall as one of those 14 water bodies that we conducted an index netting survey on. That survey showed a decline in the overall walleye population. There's now lower numbers of mature walleye. There's a few remaining large fish, but also signs that, there's limited numbers of smaller fish. So potentially we've got some recruitment issues with that population. So it did drop an FSI status there from as well, as shown on the graph. As a result, fisheries is considering changes to the overall management objectives and sport fishing regulations for walleye at Burnt Stick. One option would be to change the regulation to 1 fish no size for walleye. This certainly would increase harvest opportunity, but would lead to the fastest rate of decline in both your harvest and catch rates over time, and would have the highest chance of that the stocked walleye population could be lost from that lake. Another option is to apply regulation of one walleye under 50 centimeters. This would provide some additional harvest opportunity, of course, and also the catch and release enjoyment of those larger walleye remaining in the lake. This option would lead to maybe a more moderate rate of decline in catch and harvest rates, and a smaller chance that the stocked walleye population would be lost from the lake. The last option there is to change back to a catch and release regulation to recover the walleye in burnt stick. Once recovered, of course, we would again ask for angler input on how to manage the walleye fishery there. But we're also interested in hearing your view on if burnt stick should be a candidate for future walleye stocking, as that walleye stocking program is now hopefully available for the 2021 season here. Our last lake here is Wabaman Lake. It's located just 45 minutes west of Edmonton, right along Highway 16. This water body has 120 years of recorded recreational and commercial overfishing in its past. Also, it includes the impacts of the 2005 oil spill that occurred there as well. The current and the focal management objective has been walleye restoration, as reintroduction and stockings of walleye have occurred in 2010 and throughout to 2014, so 4 years in a row. Along with that, there were some adult walleye transfers in order to help bolster that restoration efforts to create that self-sustaining population. Following the closure of the commercial fishery and the 2005 oil spill, the sport fishing regulations were changed to catch and release only. Following that, Wabaman then became a really well-known destination to catch a high number of pike with a very good chance of catching a true trophy-size fish. The results of the 2018 consultation on the fisheries management objectives for Wabaman, at that time, there was support to continue with the walleye restoration and that trophy pike fishery. As a result, the catch and release regulations continued. However, that Wabaman fishery has changed since the last 2015 assessment. Fisheries have been receiving many reports that the pike are now fewer, both in size and numbers, and that the walleye have become much more abundant, but on average, they're still relatively small. The recent index netting survey completed this past fall, again, one of those 14 lakes that we did, also supports what anglers are experiencing at Wabaman Lake. So those high catch rates of small walleye and the lower catch rates for pike. As such, fisheries is looking for your input on management options for both pike and walleye at Wabaman. Should the walleye fishery objective be changed by allowing harvest opportunities? So perhaps, considerations for tags for walleye, or perhaps maybe a slot size regulation, or the other option is to keep it catch release and allow those stocked walleye to fully mature and successfully spawn before harvest should be considered. So still creating that sustainable population. So yeah, those are the options. As for pike, the old growth trophy fishery is no longer being achieved. And again, as such, should that management objective be continued or changed? So yes, we're certainly looking for your input on the future management for Wabaman Lake. So in terms of consultation changes here in the South region for stock trout waters, we're seeking your input and feedback for 6 locations, those being Police Outpost Lake, Kirby's Pond, Quarry Lake, Wedge Pond, Bear Pond, and Big Iron Lake, as highlighted accordingly here on the map. So the first water body here, Police Outpost, is currently a quality stocked fishery since 2008, stocked annually with rainbow trout, with the objective to grow trout over 50 centimeters. Fisheries is considering changes for Police Outpost Lake and is looking for your input whether or not to keep that quality stocked objective and the regulation of allowing one trout over 50 centimeters to be harvested, or to still maintain that quality stocked objective, but to trial what would be the first stock trout slot limit regulation. So what is that? This would be intended to allow anglers to harvest smaller size trout, so 2 trout between 20 and 30 centimeters in size, and then while allowing those larger trout, so those ones that would be greater than 30 centimeters, to be released and then grow into those bigger trophy size fish. The next stocked fishery is Kirby's Pond, is also managed as a quality stocked rainbow trout fishery since 2008. Additionally, this pond was further diversified with the stocking of tagger trout in 2018. Recent changes have occurred at Kirby's Pond with respect to aeration. That being the loss of the local society that previously operated the aeration system there. And now we've got new commitments by the Alberta Conservation Association, but to only operate open water aeration up until freeze up in an effort to maximize those oxygen levels prior to winter. As such, this now results in a situation of additional risks and some more uncertainty of potentially more frequent fish kills with now no winter aeration occurring. Of course, if there are winter fish kills, this will impact the ability of meeting that quality stocked fishery of producing large trophy size trout, as it takes, generally 3 to 4 seasons for those trout to actually get that big. So simply put, if trout don't survive a winter or two, they'll never get big to get that size. Therefore, should that quality objective remain in place, noting the changes with aeration, or should this pond maybe revert back to more of a put and take stocked fishery like many others in the province? So also, anglers are being asked to consider changes to which trout species should be stocked at Kirby's Pond based on their selective management option. The next water bodies, being quarry, wedge, bear, and big iron, are grouped together. So prompted by reports of poor angling, an assessment of Quarry Lake was conducted in 2020. This assessment verified reports of illegally introduced brown trout and also determined that Quarry Lake is not viable to continue stocking of grayling and other southern Alberta lakes, since Quarry Lake has been historically that donor source for recreational grayling stockings. As such, fisheries wants to know if anglers are actually still interested in ultimately restocking these water bodies with Arctic grayling, noting that this would now be a longer term objective, as it would require creation of a new recreational brood stock within our actual hatcheries in order to stock out on a more regular basis for these lakes. This process doesn't happen overnight. It could take upwards to 10 to 12 years in order to get it up and functioning and operational, pending on many factors in order to create that brood fishery. So until those grayling are available, fisheries intends to manage these lakes as stock trout fisheries. These lakes could be managed differently from one another. For example, with different trout species, the more productive of these lakes could be managed as a quality stock fishery with regulations to promote larger average size fish, or maybe just a simple put and take. Lots of interim options available here on these fisheries and how they could be managed. So we need your feedback on these. Finally, we've got 2 notifications on rivers here in the south. The first notification is on the Tay River, with an extension of that fall angling closure to now include September 1st to October 31st to protect bull trout spawning populations during their most vulnerable period. This closure is intended to support bull trout recovery underway on the Tay River, and to note that all the other regulations for the Tay River will remain unchanged. The second one is a notification on the Blindman River with respect to removing the current bait ban to provide additional opportunities to harvest and promote removal of Prussian carp as a known invasive fish species. The use of bait by anglers is not predicted to significantly impact the populations of other sport species in the Blindman River, and all those other regulations for the Blindman would remain unchanged. So you're probably asking, what? You can actually eat Prussian carp, and yes, I've personally have tried them, and they're actually not too bad. So yeah, if you want to find out more about Prussian carp, we've got lots of great information on our website as well. So in closing, as you can see, we paid really close attention to your comments last year. With that, we made a lot of changes last season due to your input, and have done a lot of work addressing ongoing issues and concerns and issues that you've raised and supported last year as well. Again, I apologize and sorry for not getting into too much detail on some of this work, but as our time is limited here tonight in order to ensure that we have enough time to answer your questions. So huge thanks goes out to our various partners on these projects that we work collaboratively with. There's just simply too many to fit on the screen, and I don't have time to mention them all here tonight, but also thanks to you, the anglers, for being involved and also attending tonight's webinar. I think we're the most subscribed webinar thus far. So yeah, ultimately, we're here as you're the ones that get to enjoy all these great fishing opportunities in the province, and especially within this region known as the South Fisheries Region. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jason, so much for that presentation. I know you had a lot of ground to cover, but you did a really great job. So thank you for that. So we will be moving into our question and answer portion of the evening now. So I'll invite the panel to join us again and turn your videos back on. So as mentioned before, we did have questions that were submitted through Zoom that we're going to be answering. And I actually see a lot of the questions that have already been upvoted are going to be somewhat addressed through here. So what I'll do is I'll read them out, some of the questions that have come in live already, along with the pre-submitted questions so that we can group some of them together. So the first pre-submitted question that we have is from Monte, asking, will barbless hooks become mandatory? And I see Eric has also submitted a question along these lines, wondering how can we citizens help accelerate the federal changes that would restore the ability to enact single barbless hook regulations?
Hey, Janine, I can answer that one.
Thanks, Dave.
Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Okay, great. Monte and Eric and others who are interested in this. The question about whether or not Alberta will implement mandatory barbless hook restrictions, just like any other gear restrictions, such as the use of multi-point hooks or multi-hook rigs, multi-lure rigs, is really one of matching the management action clearly to a need and an expected outcome. And all of that information will be brought back to the angling community once our ability to make those regulatory changes has been restored in the federal legislation. We'll start having conversations about where we wish to have those regulations put into place. And when we do come to you, we'll be able to come to you with the information you need to help in us by informing that management decision, by providing your thoughtful recommendations and your input into that. And a number of things come into play. There's the angling pressure that the system in question is being faced with. There's the trade-offs that we expect will be part of the conversation that we'll have to have with you. We, in general, wish to keep the amount of regulation at a minimum out of concern for issues related to red tape and regulation complexity, because as things become more complex, we hear about that as well. So we want to apply targeted management actions in those situations where it is going to achieve a clear management objective, and where we recognize the trade-offs and use the best information we have available to make a good decision. In terms of, I guess, the question with regards to what Albertans can do to accelerate the action by the federal government to open up that that legislation, I think, you know, we've definitely heard loud and clear so far. We have communicated our intent to do this with the federal government. In the online surveys, if folks wish, if you have opportunity to make a comment, not necessarily in response to a particular question, but in a comments box, to emphasize your desire to see those federal regulation changes made, and not just focusing on barbless hooks again, but gear restrictions that involve other forms of hook types. Please do so. And that information is being logged, it's being captured, and we will use it to inform our management decisions. So hopefully that helps. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dave. All right, so our next pre-submitted question has lots of interest tonight, and I know Jason covered this in the presentation, but I'll just read through all of the questions that are on Lake Wabaman, and then I'll open it up to the panel for response. So our pre-submitted question comes from Brandon, asking, why does harvest of all species on Wabaman Lake still sit at 0? Is there no opportunity for harvest of whitefish or perch? And then live tonight, we've received 3 questions on this topic. So one from Myron, wondering when will we be able to keep fish from Lake Wabaman? One from Jason, wondering what has the most Pike data determined for pike and whitefish populations in Wabaman Lake, age, class, structure? And one from Ray, saying Wabaman Lake has no recreational harvest of any fish since 2005. Have the large walleye numbers reduced pike and whitefish numbers? And has the condition and growth of the walleye been reduced? So lots of interest in Wabaman Lake tonight so far.
Okay, yeah, I'm up, Stephen Spencer. I work in the area around Wabaman, and would be happy to speak to those. And I have in my laptop a presentation ready to go, but I don't think we have time for that, so I'll try to cover it quickly. So I've often thought that it would be really cool to have a time machine as a fish biologist to go back in time and see what things were like. But the cool thing is there's reports from federal fisheries before Alberta was a province of some of these lakes, how they fish. So it's pretty neat to go back and look at those old reports. And Wabaman started to get fishing back in the late 1890s, so over 120 years ago. And 3 years later, the fishery guardian at that time said, you know, we're getting kind of worried the fish are getting smaller, this lake might be getting overfished. So that was like 120 years ago, which is crazy. So yeah, Wabaman's got a long history of harvest. By the 1920s, it looks like walleye were fished out. So Wabaman isn't well connected to another water body where walleye could come back in. Lac St. Anne, nearby Lac St. Anne got really low at times, but there's areas like Devil's Lake or Owl Lake or even the Sturgeon River where the fish could come in. But they seemed like walleye were wiped out in the 1920s, and I've got 80 years of commercial fishing data, and it's really seemed like there was ecological imbalance at that time. The whitefish numbers were cycling like crazy, and the commercial fishermen would say, they're getting super skinny, you know, what's going on here? So it really seemed like they were missing predators in the lake. So the commercial fishery was shut down in 2004, and then we had the oil spill. So there wasn't a lot of fishing for a period there. And as many of you know, we started to see some really nice pike in the fishery. And it also seemed like a really good time to put walleye back in the lake. And we did a whole bunch of consultation at that time. And I thank those of you that helped us with that. That was a big project. And so The management objective 2010 till very recently, the major one was to get walleye back in the lake, and then also people were very keen on those northern pike, and so we did an assessment this last fall, and we're no longer achieving the really big pike objective. I had complaints of flotillas of boats fishing, pike floating into shore. So, and then with the walleye introduction, it seems like pike numbers are lower. Whitefish numbers are in great shape. We're seeing really nice whitefish in our surveys. So, and our 2020 survey, it's online now, so you can go check that out under our Fin surveys, Alberta, Wabaman Lake. So that's there. And so because we weren't achieving that northern pike objective, we were putting forward this year walleye on SHL, and that and some sort of harvest of whitefish as well. So yeah, I'm really glad to that people are asking these questions, because yeah, no, it's there. So please see the survey and get all the information on Wabaman, and let us know what you want to do next summer as far as fishing at Wabaman. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Stephen. All right, so our last pre-submitted question that we have before we move fully into the live section tonight comes from Andre. And Andre is wondering, is AEP working to restore the protection for special areas that was last removed in regards to the open coal mining in the foothills? Oh, Stuart, I can see you talking, but you're still muted. There's got to be one every night.
Yeah, me more than others. Thank you. Oh, terrible. Thank you, Andre, and to many others for your questions about coal mining and fish. I'd like to take this opportunity to address how AEP Fisheries Management Team approaches cumulative effects and fish, noting that our teams won't be able to speak to the specifics of any particular project or industry-related items tonight. If you participated in the native trout recovery session that we hosted last Thursday, you will recall how our team of fish experts and scientists approached the problems of fish declines on these slopes in the systematic and scientific way. This structured approach is necessary to understand the key stressors for fish and recommend appropriate actions to address those factors, with the intention of improving the conservation status of those species. We do this by including the stressors that affect fish populations into a model that helps us sort through the complexities of those factors that affect fish, regardless of the source or industry. Some examples of this could include sedimentation, direct alteration of habitats, fragmentation, inputs of nutrients or other chemicals or substances, mortality from angling or other sources, hybridization with other species, and the list goes on. It is important to note that many of the stressors or factors are not specific to any particular activity or industry. Our team considers each of these as they assess risk and recommend actions to manage fish populations. These stressors and recommended actions will be included into the science and cumulative effects modeling completed for each species reflected in our recovery planning, and will help inform our fisheries management objectives and conservation actions. We'd appreciate questions about coal and encourage you to write either the department at the AEP Info Center or through Alberta Connects. Thank you very much for your opportunity to answer this question.
Perfect. Thanks, Stuart. I know that's yeah, a really hot topic on the top of people's minds right now. All right, so we're going to move back into the live section. So we had some questions that we had already covered based on the pre-submitted questions, and now we'll move sort of fully into the live section of tonight. So first up, we have a question from Philip, wondering, due to increased angling pressures thanks to COVID-19, will you bring in catch and release on all streams with native fish, reduce general trout limit from 5 to 3, or bring back limit to per family and not per person? If no, why not?
Janine, I think I'll maybe start answering that one and provide some opportunity for Jessica Riley to chime in, as well as the local biologist in that in portions of these slopes. So Philip, thanks for the question. Going back to what I said earlier, I really want to emphasize that our management actions, especially when we're talking about increasing restrictions on Albertans, really need to be well evaluated in light of the best information we have, and to support management objectives and regulations, management intent that is pretty clear and supported by Albertans. I think the biggest driver with respect to the impacts of angling on fish populations is really the amount of fishing pressure a fish population receives. As you can probably well understand, remote fishing destinations that have very little in the way of fishing pressure can almost go unregulated. They're just not going to get the kind of fishing use and fishing related mortality that will have really an effect on the population. Now, other end of the spectrum, of course, very intensively used systems, they need considerable management attention on them to not only determine what the management intent is and what the objectives are, but what tools need to be put in place to manage that very intensive pressure. And the question of whether catch and release is needed on a system or not really depends on what species are present, what their status is, what fishing pressure is currently, the system is currently facing. And we have to be mindful too of potentially unintended consequences of increasing restrictions. We may divert angling pressure unintentionally to other places that don't have the same amount of restriction. So we really need to be thoughtful about it. We have an approach in Alberta to model what we call basically cumulative effects of a fish population in a system. So that includes habitat-related effects, even things like climate change, when we can model those variables, changes to land use, changes to fishing pressure, and the status of the population itself. So we can actually model, we'll use the model to evaluate which are the strongest threats of a suite of threats. And that's very useful to us, because otherwise we just spend time talking about all of the threats. And we really need to focus in on the 3 or 4 that are most important. So if angling pressure and angling related mortality in our basically science is shown to be one of the primary threats on the system, then yeah, catch and release may be one of the best approaches to managing that. Or it could be other regulations put in place to reduce the effects of angling in that system. So I think I will leave it there because I'm sure Jessica may have something she wishes to add, because in my response, I probably did hit all the points that were captured in the question. So thanks.
I don't actually have much to add, Dave, except I will mention that for our species at risk, trout species at risk specifically, Athabasca rainbow trout, west of cutthroat trout, bull trout, and also Arctic grayling, which is a salmonid, there is already catch and release regulations in place for those species. And just to kind of reiterate what you're saying, as much as possible, we try to avoid blanket type regulations. We really like to, as much as possible, match the fisheries management objective and regulations to a population, so that we're making sure that our management approach is a match with the local conditions and what's going on. And it also gives us the flexibility to meet different types of angler desires across the landscape. So in some places, folks, find harvesting non-native trout and mountain whitefish, very important. In other places, they would like to see more of a blue ribbon trophy type fishery established, and that might be more of like a catch and release regulation. So again, as much as possible, applying the fisheries management objective and regulations to a population rather than a wide sweeping change. And that's it. Thank you.
Ginny, maybe just one thing I did fail to touch on that I can touch on quickly is the question about bag limits. And really the matter of bag limits, changes to bag limits really only are effective when a substantial proportion of the anglers actually catch 5 fish or 10 fish or whatever the maximum bag limit is. So if a relatively small proportion of anglers are catching the daily bag limit, reducing the daily bag limit from say 5 to 10 may not have a big effect. If the majority of anglers are only catching 1, 2, or 3 fish in a trip, that's not an effective change. So again, we don't want to make changes to regulations that aren't meaningful and aren't effective. It just causes frustration in the long run.
Great. Thank you, Dave and Jess, and thank you to Philip for that great question. So Adam, I see you have a question here wondering if we can speak to stream access and trespassing. Many of Spring Creeks run through private land. Access is becoming more difficult. Can you explain the high water mark? So this is a question that we will actually defer tonight to our colleagues over in the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Services. So what I'll do, Adam, is I'll take that question and I'll send it off to our friends over there and make sure that we get a response back to you. And for everybody else who's listening live, we will also post that response on our Ask the Expert. So last week we had a couple of questions that came in that were more specific to enforcement and regulations. And so we'll pass that on and get a response back to you on that. So thank you for your question. So next up, we have 2 questions here. So one from Warren, wondering why has stocking of grayling in southern Alberta stopped? And I also have another question here from Todd, wondering why is it going to take 10 to 12 years to get wedge and bear ponds in shape for the Arctic grayling broodstock program?
Yeah, Paul Christensen here from the Cochrane office. I'll answer that question. So that's a really good question, and Jason covered off a lot of aspects of this in his presentation. So I don't want to duplicate too many of those answers, but essentially because there was a non-native fish species found in there, Quarry Lake had historically been used as the wild broodstock that we used to take eggs and milk from, put them in the hatchery, and then we'd stock a portion back into Quarry and then out into Wedge, Big Iron, and Bear Pond. What happened is because of that non-native species that was put in there, we were unable to have a successful spawn take, which meant we weren't able to do that. So right now we are seeking angler input to see whether or not that is something they would like us to see us do again. Now, the challenge with having a wild broodstock like that is it can be very expensive or time consuming, or as we've recently learned, very unpredictable in terms of being able to get a constant or a guaranteed supply of fish. So what we would look at doing this time is, if this is something that anglers want, we would look to create a captive broodstock. So that would be one that would be developed within the hatchery system. And that is much like the hatchery fish that come out in the form of rainbow trout or tiger trout. We have very secure supply of fish that we can reliably harvest to be able to guarantee at a regular stocking interval that we'll be able to supply those lakes. We know in the case of Big Iron and Bear, it can grow very, very big fish very quickly, but it's subject to winter kill, which means that if we have winter kill in year 3 and we skip a year, that's a year that anglers aren't able to enjoy those fisheries. So if we created a captive broodstock, that would give us a more reliable supply, and we really look forward to hearing what Albertans' thoughts are on whether or not this is something they'd like to see in the future. Now, the reason that it takes as long as it does is right now with the current hatchery facilities, we don't have space right now where we can accommodate that captive broodstock. The other issue is it may seem really straightforward. Well, why don't you just go up north and grab a few grayling and stick them in there and then take their eggs and spawn them out quickly? There's a bunch of reasons why we don't just do that. Some of them relate to making sure that we're not robbing wild stocks that may be at risk in the first place. And the second is that there are disease considerations when you move live fish, and there are regulations that prevent us from doing that. So what we usually do is we take milt and eggs from those fish and put them in the hatchery. But essentially 10 to 12 years is about the time it's going to take before we could potentially accomplish the upgrades to the hatchery system to accommodate this captive broodstock. And then once we have that space available, we would then do a spawn take from a population that would not be put in peril by taking some eggs and milt from them. And then it takes several years for those fish to mature and then subsequently be able to produce eggs and milt to be able to supply outstocking in the future. So I hope that answered your question.
I'm just going to jump in, Paul, from the hatchery's perspective. The brand new facility at Raven should be hopefully functioning by 2023. We'll have a dedicated area for the biologists to use for recreation and grayling. So the idea is to have our own brood fish in their new Raven. But as Paul did a great job in explaining things, hopefully it'll take about 3 years to establish a brood population. So if we're lucky and we're actually up and with eggs in 2023, the earliest year would be 2026. I mean, that's really wishful thinking, but it's going to take a while. We never had space before for a dedicated grayling brood program. And with the new Raven, it's going to allow us that option.
Great, thank you, Craig and Paul. Our next question comes from Brent, saying, like a 24-inch trout, catching and releasing a 40-inch plus pike has become a bucket list item for hundreds of people in southern Alberta. How and where, for which lakes and reservoirs can be managed to become a trophy pike system, and how long would it take to become a reliable trophy system? Would making a pike lake entirely catch and release facilitate or be detrimental to this goal? And is it realistic in southern Alberta?
I'll take that one, Janine. That's a great question. Thanks, Brent. I can certainly speak to reservoirs in the south, and I think really it comes down to the things that we need to have quality pike fisheries and reservoirs. They're managed for agriculture primarily, not for fish. So one of the things that we need for pike is a stable near shore habitat with vegetation, with food, with places to spawn that is reliable for those fish. And unfortunately, in most of our reservoirs, we simply don't have that. The annual operation of reservoirs just is fill them up, draw them down, and that obviously most significantly affects the nearshore habitat, which is what pike rely upon. And then, of course, we also have angling pressure. Certainly, that has gone up. All of the reservoirs, all of this stuff in southern Alberta has a great deal of access. There are no issues around access. We do have a few reservoirs that certainly are balancing, or they're operated at more consistent levels over time, and we have seen some pretty decent pike fisheries in those places. Although we've seen pike populations in places that have current catch and release regulations and that have had those for a number of years not recover. And we don't certainly don't have a solid answer for that. I mean, it certainly likely has to do with many of those places are winter pike fisheries. Fishing has changed a lot, particularly through the ice with cameras and bait and different gear. As well as the number of people fishing for pike in the winter and the handling. I get quite a few pictures of pike that are to be released, but they're lying on the ice to take the picture. Those things, exposure to cold air, those handling of pike, that all affects it. So it becomes really challenging to have a reliable trophy system. And I think people want, if people want that sort of thing, there probably are a few reservoirs we could look at, but they have to be, they have to have some sort of stability so that we could develop those nearshore areas with the vegetation in particular. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I can jump in there, Shane, as well. So yeah, certainly there, as Shane mentioned, there's some concerns with certain reservoirs, but I think one example comes to mind is actually Berry Creek or Carroll side, where we did see some significant recovery of that reservoir, and it did produce some truly trophy-sized fish. But again, the main factor is whether or not it's supported by the majority of anglers as a trophy quality fishery, because yeah, again, that angling effort will ultimately affect that objective. If the effort's simply too high, there's lots of catch and release mortality. Even if it is catch and release, that may impact that fishery in terms of achieving that goal. So again, maybe if that is a desire, we may have to look at some more restrictive access in terms of actually maintaining that, especially here in the south where we don't have a lot of opportunities. It's not a fly-in fishing location. Those have to be considered as well. So yeah, just wanted to provide that as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Shane and Jason. So our next question comes from Luke. Does the AEP have any data to suggest that walleye are outcompeting pike, causing an ecological imbalance in many Alberta lakes? It appears that walleye recruitment often overachieves between fin testing dates. Is AEP being too cautious in their walleye population estimates? You have to unmute yourself, Stephen.
First time I've been doing so well. Hi, Luke. I think I just sent you an email this evening. You'd emailed me about something else. So great to get more questions from you. And you cover a lot of material there. I mean, that's a couple of graduate courses at university, some of your questions there. So first of all, as far as our pike or walleye out competing pike, so the good news is there's an article going out for publication right now in I think it's North American Journal of Fisheries Management. I think it should be available next month, but just to get to the punchline, the analysis was very, very involved, and there was not evidence that walleye were affecting pike numbers. And just to explain a little more on that, when we brought the walleye regulations in, they came in before the pike recovery plans, so the walleye got a real head start. And when we brought the northern pike regulations in, we didn't provide the same amount of protection to pike. So those two things really delayed the recovery of pike. We are starting to see some recoveries at, say, Lac Saint Anne, but some of our lakes are still slow. And it's basically like having an investment, and one you've got $1,000 and the other one you got $10. It's going to take a long time for that $10 to grow in amount. So we need to really go after pike if we're going to get them to come back. So the second part of your you talked about ecological imbalance. So that's really a thing, and that's what we went through in the 80s and 90s when a lot of fisheries were badly collapsed, and it can be a big problem for a lake. And so the ecology is you collapse the predatory fish, and that allows for a huge increase in the number of small fish like minnows, perch, that sort of thing that become very abundant. They tend to eat the zooplankton in the lake. That's what graze on algae, and so lakes can get quite green if you collapse the predatory fish. And the other thing that can happen, and this we've seen on several lakes, is you'll get a new top order predator. Instead of having pike and walleye, you get cormorants and loons and pelicans coming in, and thousands and thousands. I mean, if you've been on Lac La Biche, it's spectacular what an ecological imbalance looks like. So we went through that. We've got the predatory fish back. They're keeping the minnow numbers down, which is a system which is more stable and more in tune with what we'd see naturally. So that's that. So let's see what else. Is AEP being too cautious in their walleye population estimates? So we're continually looking at our science. So as we get more science, we revise our estimates. So yeah, it's constantly evolving, and you'll see it change as we get more information. So yeah, that's answer. Good questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. All right, so our next questions here are around some water bodies in the south. So one question here from Eric: what would have to happen for AEP to consider catch and release only in the Elbow Sheep, Highwood, Old Man, Crow, etc. East Slope watersheds with single barbless hooks, assuming that can be brought back? And then there's another question here from Kevin, just wondering about, will you put seasonal closures back on the Crow's Nest River?
Hi, Eric and Kevin. I'm just going to start out, and then I think Paul might jump in, because that's quite a long list of rivers that you mentioned there, especially Eric here. So in general, we have our rivers managed in a way that we have a little bit of a risk management offset, in which we can see then where we have the species at risk that we need to protect and have the least amount of impact on, and then which rivers can we leave open up to harvest, or to at least some kind of more fishing efforts by anglers, so that you have the opportunities to at least catch a fish, mostly catch and release. So when we look at most of the rivers in the East Slopes, they're already all predominantly catch and release, with some exceptions that have whitefish still open for harvest, or invasive species such as brook trout open for harvest. Specifically to your question on the Crow, the Old Man, which are in my jurisdiction, we have most of them are catch and release. The Crow's Nest was actually put on a year-long open season to take a little bit of effort away from all the areas where we have species at risk. So from the Upper Old Man, for example, because people fish both of those areas at the same time, sometimes even the same day. So the interesting thing was, and that brings me over to Kevin's question, is that the Crow's Nest River, for example, that regulation was put in at the point where we didn't know there was whirling disease. And you probably have heard about whirling disease, and the Crow's Nest River is probably the river in Alberta that has at least the best documented impact of whirling disease on the fish population. So there is some changes coming there. There is a report out on whirling disease and the impact of whirling disease on the Crow's Nest River that you can find in the link section of the website that we have open right now. And I'd be happy to speak more on that if that's required. Other than that, we're looking at more regulations on that river, depending on what we can figure out how to deal with whirling disease after now we know that it is there, and how to understand how we can recover that system. Paul, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. And I'm actually reminded of something that my colleague Stephen Spencer said earlier. He brought your attention to some of the very early fisheries reports, and it's really fascinating to go through a lot of these historical accounts of what kind of fish were present and in what numbers. And one thing that we found, one river that I manage is the Bow River. And it was found that as early as 1900, they recounted that there were hardly any fish that you could catch, whereas people were able to harvest a lot of them before. So if you really look back at the history of Alberta's fishing regulations, really it started from a place of assuming fish were present and allocating high numbers. And as more information became available, and largely based on anecdotal catch stories or decreased angler catches, you would probably note that regulations decreased and decreased and decreased and decreased over time. So where we find ourselves today, if you are an angler that prizes harvest experience, you're probably finding that there are not a lot of places left where you can harvest fish. And some of that is owing to especially Southern Alberta's very high angler effort, and also a bit of a shift in some of the focus and interest of anglers in the South that seem to be prizing recreational angling more for its enjoyment and recreational attributes rather than the ability to harvest fish. So it's a very difficult question to answer. Whereas previously, fish were perhaps allocated with the desire to provide for harvest opportunities as scientific inquiry and as study techniques and our ability to monitor populations improved. We found that a lot of the fish that had maybe had very high bag limits in the past maybe did no longer sustain those fish harvests. What we find as fisheries biologists is it's actually not as easy as you might think to go survey every stream all of the time. And we like to think very carefully before we remove some of those prized harvest opportunities from anglers, as again, there are not very many of them remaining any longer. And before we do that, we want to ensure that, in fact, there is no surplus to be able to harvest. So some of it is us combining population studies, demonstrating that there isn't a harvestable surplus, and combining that with some of the predominant social interest of anglers. And again, recognizing that there are precious few opportunities to harvest fish in a lot of Southern Alberta. So I hope that partially answered your question. I know it wasn't a perfect answer to it, but it can be very difficult to try to just in one fell swoop say that all rivers are catch and release at all times. So thank you for the question.
Great, thank you, Paul and Andreas. So we have a question here from John just saying, hello, in previous webinars, it has been mentioned that we can reach out and contact AEP if we wish to support a perch management plan. Who do we contact directly? So when you registered for the webinar this evening, there is a contact email that is included to our AEP info center. So if you have, or if you want to be connected directly with a fisheries biologist, you can contact the info center and then they'll be fanning it out to sort of the appropriate areas for that. And John will also type in the email into Zoom here shortly too, so you can see it there. So just wanted to address that. And our next question comes from Douglas. Many anglers cannot correctly identify trout, and we currently have bull trout listed as an endangered species and West Slope cutthroat listed as threatened. Can we get regulation changes in place to make all angling in waters containing these species catch and release of all species of fish and only single barbless hooks allowed? Angling pressure is increasing every year. If we want to save our native species, we need to take firm actions. Always clean, cold water, and trout first, fishermen last.
Hi, Douglas. I'd like to answer your question here. So yes, you are right. Bull trout and West Slope cutthroat trout are listed actually as threatened species in the province. And as I think several of us have talked to today, what we always try to do is really match our management tool or recovery action to local conditions. So rather than, again, taking kind of a blanket approach here, the first step in recovery planning is to complete a cumulative effects modeling exercise. And that helps us identify which threats we think are limiting populations. Right now, we think that angling mortality is limiting many of these native trout populations, but not all of them. The next step would then be trialing some tools to help us reduce angling mortality. And those could be tools like what you've mentioned here, things like changes to barbless hooks. We've also heard from many other folks during these webinars, ideas about limited entry. And these would be, again, pilot projects to make sure that these tools actually do work and we do see a response in fish populations before we start applying them to multiple populations across the watershed. The two big constraints that come to mind trying out some of these different techniques have to do with having enough public support to move forward with some novel approaches to regulations, and also our legislative ability to implement, particularly the gear type changes that so many anglers are bringing up. So those are kind of two pieces we would have to keep in mind before making changes. And really, if we wanted to, again, move forward with some novel approaches to pilot to help us recover native trout, we would be reaching out to anglers and hearing their concerns and ideas to really help us shape what those pilots might look like. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add a little bit to what Jessica said there. Yeah, no, so I think, regulation changes will be part of it, but I think there's also opportunities, through education programs, and I would note that the Alberta Hunter Education Instructors Association, or AHIA, does now have an Alberta fishing education program that is available online. If you have a young fisherman in your life, it would be this might be something to do, and maybe cut back a little bit on Netflix and do something online that could benefit fish. And I think, as ethical fishermen, we really got to get out there and promote the brand. And there's some really great online resources like keepemwet.org and fishsmart.org. Resources that are really, I think, just working to change the culture of fishing so that we all improve and optimize our handling practice to minimize incidental mortality from catch and release. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so I have a question here from Robert. There's many different opinions on barbless hooks. Many people say you have to only go barbless, and other research says there's very little difference in mortality with barbs. The biggest killer of fish is total mishandling and overhandling. What is the real difference in mortality of fish with barbs?
I can answer that. Robert, thanks for the question. It's very insightful, I think, that you asked that, because you're correct. When you speak to, I think, the difficulty with disentangling the effects of barb versus barbless hooks from the other factors that have influenced fish mortality in the studies. And, there's a number of variables. There's, water temperature, hook location, fight time, handling time. Probably the biggest factor, I believe, based on the information that we have today, is really air exposure time. And that's why, that message of keep them wet is so important. You can imagine running around a block doing a sprint and then coming home and having somebody, kind of impede your breathing. It's not going to feel very good. You're going to be under stress. If that happens repeatedly, if it happens acutely, you could die. If it happens repeatedly, the effects of that, the chronic effects of that could hurt you over time. And it's similar with fish. So, you're right. The science with regards to barb versus barbless, amidst the other variables that affect fishing mortality, we'd like it to be crystal clear. It's not. What we're trying to do, I think, overall, is understand the effects of fishing pressure more broadly on our fish populations and manage those effects holistically. But again, I want to emphasize that there are decisions that anglers can make in the field based on what they know. They can choose to pinch down barbs. They can choose to use single hooks. They can choose to stop fishing when water temperature is higher, when stream flows are really low. They can choose to stop fishing if they've caught and handled a lot of fish in a day. And knowing that there's many other anglers on that system, it's all about, overall effect. And certainly they can choose to not take a photograph, to not hold a fish out of water for as long as it might take to wait for it to get still enough to take that photograph, or taking photographs underwater or when the fish is largely immersed in the water. Very attractive photos. It takes a little bit more to set up for those, but if you're not fishing alone and can can do that, I think it's very helpful. So I hope that answers the question. I think you're going to hear more from us on the whole topic of fishing mortality in the times to come. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dave. So a question from Kelsey. Are there going to be special harvest licenses handed out to trained anglers to remove brook trout from all drainages that bull trout are having issues with competition?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Kelsey. That's a really good question. And it might seem as though the answer to that one is really straightforward. And this is something that we've actually tested over the past few years. There was an excellent program that was initiated in the Southwest region here a few years ago that had the intent to harvest brook trout to try to relieve or alleviate some of the competition risk from some of the native bull trout and cutthroat trout. So that's a perfectly reasonable and logical hypothesis. What we found is at the end of that program, having anglers target brook trout was in fact very successful for reducing brook trout. What was challenging is that it doesn't eliminate the smaller brook trout. And there's something that fisheries biologists refer to as a compensatory response. So when all the adults are removed from the population, it essentially elicits a response in the population where they all make babies. And then when the fish are very, very small, they're very difficult to catch. So the problem just kind of feeds itself. And we've found this in other studies as well, where we have tried to deplete brook trout populations through netting or electrofishing, only to find that it didn't actually remove the problem. The other issue that we have with a targeted program that looks to remove brook trout is that it actually, it's very difficult to target the specific fish you're trying to remove, and cutthroat and bull trout end up being caught. And according to the studies that we did on that, they're actually about 2.5 times more catchable than brook trout. So what ends up happening is that we end up cycling through more cutthroat and bull trout while we're trying to get rid of the brook trout. So that just kind of ends up putting a bit of a lid on the recovery itself. I think one thing that we are definitely willing to continue is to allow the harvest of brook trout as an angling and harvest opportunity. So we just want to be clear that the goal isn't to remove brook trout expressly for the purposes of trying to recover native trout populations, but those fish can be made available for a harvest opportunity to enjoy fish with your family. Thank you for the question.
Great, thanks, Paul. So for our last question of the evening, we have a question from Colin saying the Central Alberta chapter of Trout Unlimited Canada put forward a sum of money to have the aerators reinstalled at Kirby's Pond. This pond is or was a great fishery in East Central Alberta. It has produced some very nice rainbow trout and was stocked with tiger trout. Needless to say, why can't this fishery be maintained as a catch and release fishery that produces large trout?
Hi, Colin. Thank you for your question. Kirby's Pond is actually in my management area, so I'm happy to answer your question. The efforts of various stakeholders at Kirby's Pond over the years have certainly been greatly appreciated. This includes the Friends of the Kirby's Pond, which actually envisioned the possibility of Kirby's to produce trophy-sized trout and installed and operated the equipment for many years. It also includes organizations like the ACA and the Central Alberta chapter of TUC for your contributions. So thank you. The aeration equipment will continue to be operated moving forward. And there actually has been some recent upgrades to make this equipment more efficient. However, our current commitment for aeration at the site only includes open water aeration. This is due to issues with liability of operating the equipment over the winter, as well as the costs of running and maintaining that equipment during the winter months. So aeration will operate through the open water season, and it will be shut off in likely early December with the intent of maximizing the dissolved oxygen levels prior to the winter months. As Jason mentioned in the presentation, this will help with maintaining dissolved oxygen levels, but because of this, there are additional risks and uncertainties with the potential for more frequent fish kills with no winter aeration. If there are winter fish kills, this will impact the ability of Kirby's Pond to meet the quality stocked fishery objective of producing that large trophy-sized trout. Again, he mentioned if the trout can't survive for a winter or two, they just simply won't get big enough to be a trophy trout. The current online engagement survey includes a section on Kirby's Pond. We're consulting to see what anglers would like to see for the management objective of Kirby's, whether it's to keep the current management objective of a quality stocked fishery with these uncertainties, or if they would like to see a change to a put and take fishery. So please take the time to complete the online engagement survey, provide your comments as well. Let us know what species of fish you would like to what species of fish you would like to see at Kirby's. So thank you for your comment, thank you for your question, Colin. We appreciate it.
Perfect, thanks, Caitlin. All right, folks, so that brings us to our closing for the evening. So thanks again for spending your night with us, talking all about fisheries changes in the South. As mentioned several times tonight, we do have that survey that's open for the 21-22 sport fishing regulations. If you just Google it, it'll come up, and that survey is open until February 8th at 9 a.m. So please fill it out. That is really where we're collecting all of our feedback from. Additionally, on our engagement webpage, you can find lots of good opportunities. So we do have fact sheets posted for each of the water bodies. So if you're interested in learning more about the changes that Jason went through in his presentation tonight, you can check those out. And again, we have our Ask the Expert available as well. So if we didn't get to your question tonight, please submit them there, and or check out the other questions that have already been submitted as well. So we have 2 webinars left in our series for the Northwest and Northeast over the next 2 days. So please join us if you like to fish in those areas or interested in learning more. They'll be following a very similar format to what we've done so far, so you won't see too many changes there. And last but not least, we'd like to invite you to follow us on Facebook. So this is where we do a lot of our communicating about the great work that our fisheries biologists do. And you can check out and see sort of what's happening in the fish world. And of course, coming up, we have our family fishing weekend on February 15th through 17th, where you can fish without a sport fishing license, but all regulations still apply. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for joining us tonight. If you have any feedback on the webinar this evening, you will be directed towards a survey in an internet browser when you leave tonight. So if you could please fill that out, we'd greatly appreciate it. We do read all of the comments that come in to try and improve our engagements moving forward. So thanks again for spending your night with us, and have a wonderful evening, everybody. We hope to hear from you soon.